Welcome, everyone. Hello, I'm Michelle Bloom. I'm the CEO of the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce in New South Wales, and I'd really like to thank you all very much for joining us. Today, it's 8.5 weeks since the horrific attack on Israel by Hamas on October 7. The war that has continued since then has clearly inflicted not only a devastating human toll, but also had a hugely disruptive impact on economic and business activity. As an example of its impact, in Israel, the war has meant that approximately 20% of the workforce has become unavailable, either called up to reserve duty in the army or else cut off from their workplaces as part of the 200,000 citizens who've been evacuated from the north and the south of Israel. But we know that Israel and Israelis have been through many crises before, and that resilience is one of the primary characteristics of the country, its people, and its innovation ecosystem. So we're pleased that our session today will explore the actual impact that the war has already had, and that we expect it to continue to have on Israel's general economy, as well as its renowned tech sector. To help us unpack all of this, we're really pleased today to be joined by two experts. Firstly, Ohad Blumberg, the Israel Trade Commissioner in Australia, and Jonathan Medved, the founder and CEO of OurCrowd. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome my colleague Paul Israel, the Executive Director of the Israel-Australia Chamber of Commerce, who is online and who's going to join us at the end of the session to provide a wrap-up and vote of thanks. So our session today is going to run for just 1 hour, and shortly I'll introduce Ohad and John, who will each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. After that, we'll have the opportunity for some Q&A with them both for about 15 minutes. So if I can ask you all to get your questions ready for John and Ohad, either now or whilst they're speaking, and to help us, please do write your questions into the chat so we can see them. So now it's my pleasure to briefly introduce our speakers today. So Ohad Blumberg has been with the Israeli Ministry of Economy and Industry Foreign Trade Administration since 2014, and he became the Israeli Trade Commissioner in Australia in September 22. The Israel Trade and Economic Commission is the commercial and investment arm of the Embassy of Israel in Australia, and its goal is to promote, enhance and facilitate trade, investment and industrial and R&D cooperation between Australasia and Israel. Prior to coming to Australia, Ohad was the Director of the Economic Department responsible for all trade-related economic analysis within the Ministry of Economy and Industry. Prior to that, he also held positions with Strauss Group, with El Al Airlines and the Ministry of Environmental Protection. Our second speaker, Jonathan Medved, is the founder and CEO of OurCrowd. John has been named by the Washington Post as one of Israel's leading high-tech venture capitalists, and by the New York Times as among the top 10 most influential Americans who have impacted Israel. Jonathan is a serial entrepreneur and investor and one of the pioneers of Israel's venture capital industry. A California native, John moved to Israel in his 20s and successfully built and exited several startups. He's also a regular television guest on CNN, BBC, CNBC, Bloomberg TV and Sky News, and is frequently quoted in many public business publications. So it's now over to you, Ohad, to start our conversation today. Thank you.
Michelle, shalom. Good afternoon, and thank you, Michelle, Paul, and your teams for your partnership and ongoing support to the Israeli industry and business community. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Ohad Blumberg, and I'm the Israeli Trade Commissioner in Australia. And as Trade Commissioner, you wouldn't normally hear me speak about political or geopolitical situation in Israel. But I have to say these are not normal times, because on the morning of October 7th, a date that unfortunately will be commemorated for the next generations, Israel was brutally attacked by ruthless and murderous terrorists of Hamas. More than 1,250 Israelis were brutally murdered, and Hamas deliberately targeted the most vulnerable, women, children, and elderly, with actions that I have to say our nation hasn't seen since the Holocaust. And Hamas terrorists also kidnapped nearly 250 people, women, elderly, among them 38 children, and some of which just witnessed the killings of their parents. Horrific images that we still continue to unfold today. But since then, Israel has been involved in a bloody war that has major implications on the civilian population, but also on the economy. So in the next few minutes, I would like to share with you some insights on the current economic impact of the recent war. And when we look at the influence of a war, or any disruption from an economic point of view, we tend to look at two dimensions, I would say, the short run and the long run. And we also tend to look at the influences and implications of past events to learn how this economic impact will unfold. So Israel on October 6th, the day before, entered the war in a relatively strong economic and financial state. Inflation, unemployment, and government debt were all maintained in a lower than average, in some cases, one of the lowest in the world in relation to other highly developed economies. And credit rating remained stable at AA. And as far as GDP, over the last 20 years, the Israeli economy has kept a relatively fast growth rate, much higher than the OECD average. And during these years, the economy also had to cope with military operations, unfortunately, and also with a full-scale war in Lebanon in 2006. So I have to say that with all these military operations, the only downfall to this fast pace was during COVID-19 pandemic, which even then, the Israeli economy went through in a much better state due to the characteristics of the economy and mainly due to its growth engine, the Israeli export, specifically the high-tech sector. And we see that although there were conflicts in the past, which had an effect in the first or second quarters after the war or the conflict, for the long run, there were no major contractions in response to regional security challenges. And in 2022, growth rate of the GDP stood at 6.1%, much higher than the OECD average. So this has given the Israeli economy the opportunity to make considerable decisions in order to support the economy in the weeks to follow. But still, what the Israeli economy is dealing with now is very unique in a historical perspective, and there are implications on the economy, and we do need to acknowledge that, and I'll mention just a few. Uncertainty is probably the most negative factor for any economy. The fact that we are in the 60th day of the war without knowing when it will end and how it will end is not something that financial or economic sectors value. And this has implications on various factors, which I will briefly point out, on GDP, export, FDI, and labor markets, but also on the financial markets performance. And regarding the labor market, as Michelle mentioned, there are three components in the market that are probably influenced the most. For the high-tech sector, the fact that we have 350,000 reservists in the IDF resulted in a shortage of between 15 and 20% of manpower in the tech industry. In the manufacturing sector, 62% of factories in Israel reported that they do experience a shortage of some kind of a skilled labor workforce. And I think the most impacted sectors are agriculture and the construction sectors. The fact that we had the returning of foreign workers back to their homes because of the war, and combined with the lack in Palestinian workers, by the way, many of them from inside the Gaza Strip, Palestinians within Gaza, due to the war, resulted in a shortage of most agriculture and construction workers today. And this is why, for those of you who visited Israel, you see many farms and construction sites that are empty today. But having said that, the vast majority of educational systems are now back almost to normal and allowing parents to be back in their working places. And many companies have also successfully switched to remote work at least 50% of the week. As for supply chain and ports, seaports remained almost in business as usual today. As for airports, in the first few weeks, import and export via air declined because most foreign carriers stopped their flights into Israel. But since then, Israeli-based carriers, mainly El Al, increased their operations instead of foreign carriers that canceled, in addition to increased operations of cargo-only carriers. And this combination pretty much filled the gap, and today we're almost back to normal in terms of cargo volumes. In the financial markets, so the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, or the main index, Tel Aviv 125, dropped by 12.2% between October 7th and 26th. But since then, it bounced back by a little bit over 9%. And as for the shekel, the currency, so despite this ongoing war, the shekel is now trading, funny enough, at its strongest position against the US dollar since mid-August, a few months before the war. As for inflation, the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, declined in the latest announcement in October from 3.8% to 3.7%, much lower than most OECD countries, also lower than the Australian CPI index. And as for interest rate, the current rate of 4.75% remained pretty much unchanged by the Bank of Israel. So for these short-term challenges, the government has concluded a plan to support the economy in three main angles. The government initiated a support plan to support businesses that were affected by the war. Those who were affected the most get higher support than the ones that were affected less. A second support scheme was announced by the Israeli Innovation Authority Emergency Fund that was concluded in order to support the Israeli tech ecosystem. And this aims to contribute to meet the immediate and future needs of the tech sector, which I'm sure John will elaborate later on. And also, in order to stabilize the shekel and to assure the financial markets, the Bank of Israel sold 30 billion US dollars of foreign reserves. But in order to look for the longer term implications, it is very difficult to monitor these, as we're still in an ongoing situation. Obviously, the longer the war will take, the longer the bounce back will be required. However, as Israel entered the war in a fairly stable financial state and encountered, unfortunately, several military and security operations in the past 20 years, we can examine how the economy behaved in the weeks and months and years after those incidents. So one element that we tend to look at is the export. In the last few years, the Israeli export has been the main driver for Israel's GDP growth. And the main sector that contributed to this increase is the high-tech sector, that increased dramatically in the last few years. And as for the Israeli export, this high-tech sector is responsible for almost 50% of total export and for 80% of the GDP. And the fact that tech companies, and I'm sure John will elaborate on that as well, were able to adapt quite quickly to the situation, working remotely, shifting some of the work to their offices overseas, allowed the sector to keep their operations pretty much uninterrupted, although there are implications to their activity. So export do prove even more resilient, with past conflicts having very limited impact. The second element is FDIs, or foreign direct investment. And FDI has seen a massive and consistent increase over the last 20 years, up until 2022. But obviously, there are delays in funding rounds due to the situation. But all in all, the tech industry is so vast and advanced in Israel that post-conflict recoveries were swift and quicker than expected, and investments remained in pretty much upward trend. But generally speaking, FDIs in Israel tend to be more influenced by global financial crises rather than by internal conflicts. But although, as I said, support is needed to some companies to go through this short-term period, which does affect on some of the companies. But resilience is not only in numbers or financial indicators. And since October 7th, we have witnessed the full scale of Israeli civilian and business resilience. And for some of those of you who did visit Israel in the last weeks, you do see that in the country. And I want to mention just a few. Last month, we had a full-scale national pavilion in the world's biggest medical device exhibition, Medica, in Germany. And I have to say that until the last minute, we were not sure if this will go ahead as planned. But the Israeli companies insisted on going ahead as planned. And we had a full team of trade officers from all over the world that managed to support the companies with nearly 1,500 business meetings, including some from Australia. Another example are fresh produce pop-up markets that have been spread around the country to support farmers that were affected from the war, especially those in the southern part of Israel. Our own Choose Israel Now campaign by our ministry to support small consumer goods companies in Israel. And if you haven't seen that yet, please go in our website and buy some Israeli goods to support these companies as well. And companies, municipalities, and other organizations open their offices for shared space to be used by people who are evacuated from their homes and communities to be able to continue their work. And so many initiatives emerged from government entities, private companies, emergency funds, VCs, most free of management fees and lower entry barriers, in order to support startups with bridging funds to maintain their activity. And I'm sure John will say a few words about that as well. So to conclude my part, the Israeli economy entered the war in a financially sound state. Israeli economy recovery in previous conflicts has been rapid. GDP growth, export and FDI typically recovering within 1 to 2 quarters at most. The tech sector remains active largely at pre-war levels due to remote work, a lower cost driven by favorable exchange rate, but also bridging funds both by government entities and VCs to support these companies as well. And support measures by the Israeli government also contribute to the bounce back effect that we do expect to see in the long term. So I want to close my remark by saying that even today, Israel and Israeli tech continue to deliver. And Israel is an island of economic power and stability in the Middle East. We see that also today. And as a leader of innovation, most of the global economic giants choose to invest in Israel and specifically in its people and in its ideas. And these will remain in Israel and still remain in Israel. Israel has no natural resources and is all about its people, its innovation. And because of that, it has been a magnet for investment in R&D capabilities. And investment in doing business in Israel was profitable before October 7th and will continue to be profitable after October 7th and in the days to come. And I invite you, and I know we have so many participants on this session, I invite you, all of you, to reach out to us or one of our partners, AICC, IACC, to learn and to explore more about the ongoing business opportunities in Israel. And again, I want to thank AICC and IACC for hosting us. And I wish we will all meet in a much better circumstances than this one. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ohad. And so if I can now invite John to speak, and just to remind everyone that we will have a Q&A session available after this. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box so we can ask those questions of John and Ohad. Thank you, John.
No? Okay, we're good. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks to Paul. Thanks to AICC. Following Ohad is a pleasure. I remember once upon a time when some of the people who were sent out to represent Israel were not as quite articulate and effective as people like Ohad. I am very impressed, and you're very, very lucky to have a emissary like that working with you, and you're doing a great job. Keep it up. These are front lines as well. What I'd like to do is to quickly give you some slides, and hopefully will actually allow for a little bit of interaction, questions and answers. Some of what I'll say will be repetitive, but there might be a little bit of the ability to see these things graphically. And let me see if I can just get my, I should be able to show a slideshow. Are you seeing a slideshow? There you go. Wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about where we are in terms of Israel and tech before the war. 14% of Israel's workforce, 18% of GDP, 30% of tax revenue, over 50% of our exports, 97 unicorns. We'll talk a little bit about that. 100 publicly traded companies in New York, which is the fourth largest delegation, shockingly, after the US, Canada, and China. Of course, Israel, number 4. Over $50 billion of venture investment over the last 3 years, 400 multinational R&D centers, and continuing sale of companies even during the war. That's what Israel's tech represents in terms of the economy. If you don't believe me, believe the people at the World Economic Forum. We used to have to show slides from the government. Now we can use their slides, giving us incredible rankings in terms of how we do in the world innovation economy. Now, when you look at this, you realize that the whole ecosystem obviously is centered around entrepreneurs, but there are many, many other elements that are critical to this ecosystem working, and that includes obviously VC funds, incubators, the multinationals we mentioned today, private equity funds, but especially the IDF tech units. And when you look at this is intact and growing and having a huge impact. These unicorns I mentioned, I just want to give you a sense of how it stacks up, right? There are about 1,000 unicorns in the world. A unicorn, of course, is a tech company still private worth $1 billion. That means that Israel has about 10%, which of course is right in line with Israel's percentage of the world population. Wrong. Israel's percentage of the world population is about 1/10 of 1%. If we were pro rata, we should have 1 unicorn. So we don't have 10, we have 100. That's 2 orders of magnitude. We are the unicorn nation. In fact, it's so dominant that when you look at the US, where unicorns are founded, Israel is just behind India, again, roughly the same population, in terms of numbers of founders who are from Israel in these tech unicorns. Per capita, we dominate in terms of VC investments. But what's most important and relevant for this discussion is what's happened across wars and conflict over the last 20 years. And it's simply a story of steady growth. And you can see that in numbers of different graphs. This is a graph about GDP and GDP per capita. You'll see there's no hiccup. Okay, here's a graph showing the same period of time, roughly, at VC investment and how it's affected by various conflicts. And then, as Ohad mentioned, stock markets, here's what's happened in the past in terms of the effect on the Tel Aviv 35, which is sort of like our premier index. And you'll see that it comes down sharply, immediately, and then goes right back up. Now, smart money understands this as a buying opportunity. And I've been talking about this for the last 60 days, saying buy, buy, buy. I am not making a recommendation for stock trading. Do not hold me responsible. But I've just been pointing out what has happened in the past. And here is what has happened over this war in the 60 days. And you can see, for example, on the left side, the performance of the Israeli shekel, where, again, it has not just recovered, but has gone up since the events of October 6th. And here you can see that same Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, where it's basically come back to par, okay, already relative to where it was October 5th before the attacks. By the way, the news has just come out over the last day or so that Hamas, or someone like them, we'll guess it's Hamas directly, bought enormous short positions on the New York Stock Exchange for Israeli stocks. I mean, literally 1,000 times the normal shorting. Someone should have caught that again, among other things. But to show you that economics are critical to warfare, certainly our enemies understand that and took advantage of their horrible and barbaric attacks to even make some money. As Ohad mentioned, our credit ratings are solid, and these are all reiterated credit ratings post-war from both Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. Okay, if you look at how quick we bounce back, Ohad mentioned the 6% or so bounce back of 22. In 21, as people were pulling out of the pandemic, Israel just led the OECD world in terms of enormous growth. See, the issue about crises is that everybody's going to face them. Today in the world, that's a constant, whether it's going to be the Israel-Hamas war, whether it's going to be the Ukraine-Russia war, a pandemic, a supply chain crisis, China, you name it, climate issues. Crisis is unfortunately part of our lives. But the question economically is, how do you navigate through it? How do you handle it? Are you set up to manage this, and are you resilient? And Israel, frankly, is the master of crisis. We were the best in terms of responding to the pandemic, in terms of vaccinating our people, being mobilized, and we're the best at bouncing back from these economic crises. Now, Ohad mentioned the strength of our economy. This is a critical piece of data, which is our debt to GDP ratio, which means how much money do we have, essentially, can we borrow if we need to spend our way out of a crisis? And you'll see the OECD average, okay, is over 100%, 110%. Israel is about half that. It's among the best in the OECD, like Korea. America is up at 130%. Japan, obviously, very, very big debt ratio. You look at our foreign reserves, the ability we had to support the shekel, and by the way, they allocated 30 billion, but they only spent 7. They didn't need to spend more than 7 billion in the propping up of the shekel. This was because our foreign reserves are off the chart. Okay, $200 billion relative to people like the UK at $100 billion, or the US at 30, or Germany at 36, is a big pile of money waiting to be used, if necessary, to strengthen the economy. Part of our growth story, of course, is our birth rate. We have a very strong underlying growth in the country. This is not a percent, by the way. It's 3 people per, I've got to fix that slide, per woman, about 2% in population growth, but still very, very strong. I want to talk about what's going on in the tech community and what we're doing at OurCrowd quickly, and then turn it over to questions. As was mentioned before, lots of people called up. Again, at our company, we have 23 people now in reserve duty out of 200, and we have another 15 spouses whose husbands or wives are in reserve duty. So almost, approaching 20% of our workforce, except we're ready to respond. We're set up for this because all year long, people are going into their reserve duties. This is not our first rodeo, as it were. We've been there before at these crises, and we're good at multitasking. We're good at having prepared plans for resilience, and we're just, through a combination of grit, hard work, and a determination expressed in the slogan, which everyone's using, Israel Tech delivers no matter what. That's what we do. And whether it's going to a tech show in Germany last week, I was in Abu Dhabi for a week, meeting around the clock. And what's happening is that Israel is not just weathering the storm, but is going to come out ahead. And what's really great and positive to see at the moment is that our friends are standing up for Israel. And it's not just the Jewish communities and those who are related to us. It is a broad stretch of many smart people around the world, but in particular, the tech community. There's been a statement signed by almost 1,000 different venture funds who have not only spoke about Israel, but are donating large sums of money. The donations, by the way, are off the charts, but are making sure that the investment scene here stays robust. And in that line, what we've done is we've launched a resilience fund, the Israel Resilience Fund, which we're making as broad a fund as possible, bringing in all kinds of people to help us to raise quickly over the next 6 months and deploy it in that 6-month period, $50 million on a no fees, no carry basis, basically management fee free, carried interest free, which means that we're basically giving our management skills on a pro bono basis. And since we announced this just a couple of weeks ago, we're up at actually over 10 million in commitments. I think we're, as of yesterday, 12 million, on the way to the 50. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about this and why it makes sense for us and for people to take a look at this. Again, the economy is strong, but certainly needs a support, because what's critical is the need to act as sort of a snowball core, where even when you come into a company with $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 at this point and say, we're in, we're not waiting, we're not delaying till the war is over, we're not going to see and check. We believe in Israel's story of resilience, and we're putting our money where our mouth is. Then that gives courage to other investors around the table who are already in the company already. It allows us to do the matching money, which the government is now providing through its first aid and other programs through the Innovation Authority. And it actually then creates interest in outsiders to say, wait a minute, if these insiders who get what's going on are doing this, why aren't we taking advantage of getting into these companies at lower prices and buying at the dip? Now, you can see what's happening. The stock market has recovered, the shekel has recovered, and what happens in these cases is that the overshoot as we go forward is going to be significant. So for the smart money, for the people who really are looking at this not just as an expression of support, but as a smart entry point, it makes a lot of sense. Now we're investing in companies that we can actually not just play a role with the snowball effect, but also extend their runways. A runway means how long they have with the cash reserves until they need their next round. And we're looking for companies where we can buy essentially 9 to 12 months. We are helping many companies who are actually involved in the war effort itself, providing all kinds of amazing technology. And we're also helping those in particular who are affected because of their geographical location, either in the north or the south, where they've experienced some degree of business interruption, which they simply, no matter how resilient they are, have had an impact. So we're looking, again, this is what we've said, we don't want to be anything over 50% of any round. And we're looking at earlier stage companies where our relatively small allocations, we hope to, by the way, help as many as 50 different companies with this fund. It depends if we get to our full target. We're going to start making investments in the next week or two, which I think is a record from the time anybody has ever announced a fund in terms of starting to raise it and then actually start deploying capital. But we want to get this money into companies' hands and to help the economy as much as we can. Now, in general, these kinds of moments are great times to be making investment. It turns out that post-recession, post-crisis, asset classes are down. That's when you buy, when things are cheap. This is simply historical best practice. These are some of the companies that we're looking at backing, companies like Emprest, who are the guys behind the Iron Dome anti-missile system, who've now actually got this in work with Queensland Power up in the north in Australia for actually managing the iron grid, okay, which is wonderful. They're also supplying Vector in New Zealand, EGBs, which is geospatial software to help target things much more efficiently and actually save lives. Cyabra fighting disinformation. Fresh Start, our incubator for food tech, located in Kiryat Shmona, exactly 1.5 kilometers from the Lebanese border. Karar, which is doing thermal management for EV batteries, located in Sderot. They actually absorbed a missile attack that was Saturday, so no one was in the company. And Bionic Hive, another Sderot company who make an amazing flexible robot, where we're co-invested with Amazon. These are some of the companies that we're looking at, and right now our pipeline of companies to invest in is well over 30. And again, I want to remind you that in downturns, that's when great companies are born. So it turns out that if you can make it through a crisis, then you're resilient. Okay, and it's sort of a great filter. So you look at these kind of companies who came in some of the most deep crises in tech, whether it's Google, Netflix, and Salesforce in the dot-com, crisis of 2000, or people like Meta, Facebook, Airbnb, and Uber, who came out of the global financial crisis. Why are we doing this? Well, we're Israel's most active venture investor. If we didn't, that's when you should ask the question of why aren't you doing it? But we are stepping up. We've got a huge number of companies in our existing portfolio database of almost 20,000 companies worldwide, with over half of those in Israel, and a digital robust platform, which is essentially supported by you, by at the moment 200 and almost 50,000 investors worldwide who belong to the OurCrowd platform over 195 countries. There's a lot more you can do other than invest. We are getting all kinds of help from people who are now stepping up to help advise, sit on advisory boards, doing what they can. There have been 7,000 doctors who have signed up to come to Israel to help in terms of our healthcare system. And we're creating vehicles to do the same for high tech. So with that, I'm going to stop my comments. Again, I want to salute and say good on you to the folks at AICC and the Israel Economic Attaché. And we stand ready to support whatever efforts you're doing in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So now thank you both, Ohad and John. That was fantastic. So I'm going to just remind everyone that if you have some questions for John and for Ohad, to please send them through the Q&A. But we do have a few questions to get us started. If you, John and Ohad, could perhaps elaborate a little bit on the activity of some of the incubators in the north and in the south that have been really impacted by the war, and how the government is really supporting those, and perhaps also having to find them some alternate space to operate in. Perhaps each of you could provide a different perspective on that.
Yeah, Ohad, I can just say quickly that we have one incubator in Kiryat Shmona who's been deeply affected. They've had to shut down their activities there. Everybody has now found alternative space. Our companies in Sderot are actually doing similar work, although actually one of them has started operating again in Sderot on a limited basis because the factory is important. This has had an impact, in particular, if you're in Kiryat Shmona or in Sderot, that matters. The people in the Ramat HaNegev have obviously been hurt. So I think programs like what we're doing, what the government are doing is critical. We'll get over it. Many of the software companies can be fully remote. The issue is more factories, okay, or people who have labs like we have in our food tech, where they really need access to their materials.
Yes. And do you have something to add, Ohad? Sorry.
Yes. Just to add to what John said, so we have to remember that besides the fact that there are businesses, there are people who live in these communities and they have family members. So many of them had to be evacuated. It wasn't even their choice. They had to be evacuated because some of the facilities were damaged or their homes were damaged. So they, some of them don't no longer at the moment live in the area. Having said that, we have, and that shows a little bit about the resilience. so many factories were back on track in Sderot, especially those who manufacture food and other essential products, but also other factories like Tfus Be'eri and Nir Lat around the Gaza envelope, but also in Kiryat Shmona. But the companies or startups that were able to move to work remotely and not in the facilities themselves, they continue to do that. And I have to say, we hear from them, we support them. Next week, we're going to have a session about food tech with one of the companies that is going to present. Is from Be'eri. That was, perhaps one of the kibbutzim that were hit in the most severe way. So we are trying to support in every way we can, but not all companies are ready for, to go back to business as usual because of the severe impact on their families and their facilities.
Yes, such a difficult situation. I'd just like to ask you both a question from Joanne Block, who requests your thoughts on the implications on a traumatized country on the economy, trade and rebound, especially as so much effort is needing to go now into rebuilding borders, communities and so on. How do we deal with the other aspects of economic rebuild that need to happen with those other things that need to be dealt with when the war does finally come to an end?
Look, the Israeli society is a hugging society. I think few places in the world will people greet each other with a hug as readily as you do in Israel. And that's before the war. Let's just say that we're doing a lot more hugging. We're doing a lot more crying. Okay. It's become completely acceptable to cry. That's it's unbelievable how much you will see big, tough guys, okay, crying. And it's normal. We are a country as a whole with PTSD. Okay, and anybody who doubts that doesn't know what's going on. We've been all affected by this. Everybody knows somebody at close range and everybody now has children or relatives or friends or colleagues who are in the fight. So this is something which is not something we read about or hear about only. It's what we live. And the horrors that we went through on October 7th will not go away, not in one generation. They'll be known for generations to come. Now, again, this is something that Jews have expertise in. Okay, this is not, b'chol dor v'dor. Okay, it's through the generations. So I guess we now have our own crisis. But really what's interesting is it's calling upon us to show that we can meet the crisis. One of the things, see here, it's bad. Okay, it's one thing to cry in your office. The other is, do this on a web. But the reality is that everybody asks, what about the kids? Okay, how are the kids doing? How are the generation of the fighters? And I got to tell you, first of all, the generation of the fighters are unbelievable. The young people now, the call-up rate was 120%. Now you say, how is that possible? Because if you call up 100 people, how do you get 120? And the answer is because people who weren't called showed up. And I think some of the most amazing stories were some of these people in their 60s and 70s who grabbed guns and went and retrieved people from the disaster that was going on October 7th. And you see that through the generations, the ability to stand up and to protect the country of Israel and our families has not diminished at all. And the young kids are fine. We're going to get through this. We're going to get through the trauma. And at a company, you simply hug and you cry and you work. You work like a dog. And what's going on at all the companies is that your people are going out and volunteering. We had 25 people yesterday picking lemons. Before that, we've been picking pomegranates. Every company is sending its people into the fields to help the farmers. And it's not just farmers, by the way, on the Otef in near Gaza, or in the north, it's farmers all over the country, because there is really a crisis in terms of foreign labor. Now, hopefully the government will get a deal done with Nepal. I think there's a discussion of 40,000, or of India, to bring people in. There's even talk now, believe it or not, about bringing Palestinian workers back in, because it's such a big issue for the country. But we're really mobilized, and I think we're doing great. But this is something where everybody can help. And I think that the support that we get, the notes, the phone calls, the involvement, everything, the political support, the social media support, really means a lot. And I want to thank everybody who's on this call for what they're doing.
Thank you, John. One of the positive, drivers of growth prior to the war was obviously the growth in business through the Abraham Accords, and there's been a couple of questions about how that's being impacted by the war, and what you see ahead for those partnerships and collaborations.
Look, I can comment quickly. I was again in Abu Dhabi last week. I was speaking publicly at huge forums, okay, with hundreds and hundreds of people, both sponsored by the government, by Fortune magazine, doing TV interviews from Abu Dhabi. And what's clear is that they have made a strategic decision for reconciliation. And there's not a weakening, there's no questioning, there's no going back. It is simply a done deal, okay? And this is done for generations. And it's not, by the way, just the Emiratis who are really doing an extraordinary job. But last week I met with a Saudi prince in Abu Dhabi, and heard that we will get back on track as soon as the guns are quiet, okay, that is going to return. There is no going back on the Abraham Accords. There is no way forward for the Middle East except for reconciliation, except for that vision of working together. That is the only vision which makes any sense other than endless war, slaughter, and barbarism. And I got to tell you, we've got good neighbors. In this case, these people are stand up, are courageous, are willing and ready to work with us. And we're seeing, believe it or not, no slowdown at all in terms of both investment we're getting, the discussions we're having. And, we have already a subsidiary in Abu Dhabi employing 18 people who are building artificial intelligence tools for the wealth management industry, including ourselves. And everything is moving along absolutely fine.
Anything you'd like to add to that, Ohad?
Just to echo what John said. So I agree. Although I'm not dealing with the bilateral economic relationship between Israel and the Gulf region, but just to add that the Abraham Accords, and especially with the UAE, is as John mentioned, these are strategic relationship. And just to give an example, there are only 6 foreign carriers that are continuing to fly to Tel Aviv. 2 of them are Emirati, Fly Dubai and Etihad, and these are a quarter of the foreign companies that are still continuing to fly despite all. And I'm sure there is a lot of pressure on them as well, and both from a business perspective, but also from a political perspective. And also, I would only mention that the fact that we have an office in Abu Dhabi that is fully operational, continuing to do so much work, and we have a delegation in COP28 this week. So there is a continuously business operations between the countries, and I hope and I don't expect it to end because of that. It's
such a positive story to hear that. Sometimes we lose sight of some of these positive stories. And I guess one of the other things that maybe will come from this terrible crisis, as often does happen, is a lot of new innovation. I mean, we saw that certainly through the pandemic, that there was so much innovation that was driven through COVID. And I just wonder to both of you what you see as perhaps some new innovations and new technology trends that may actually emerge from this current crisis.
I'm seeing a lot of activity relative to robotics and remote control in particular, which we don't need to go into long discussions about how this works in this situation, but it's pretty important to get these capabilities into the hands of the fighters in the front lines. We're seeing a lot of work going on in terms of combating disinformation. Companies like Cyabra, who are really stepping it up relative to detecting bots and combating them. And we're seeing that having a lot of work. We're seeing just a host of companies who are really going to work overtime to supply potential solutions. So I agree with you, there will be that. By the way, I was asked a question on the chat about whether or not the Resilience Fund will be investing only in OurCrowd companies. The answer is no. It will be investing broadly. And while we have a number of OurCrowd companies that we obviously track and will, I think will be worthy to get money from the Resilience Fund, we hope that at least 50% of the companies that will be funded will be outside of our portfolio, which is a big deal.
That's great. I guess maybe just one last question. Founders of startups have to be resilient in the best of times. These are the worst of times, and obviously founders are facing, as you've pointed out, diminished runways in terms of potential funding gaps. And your fund at OurCrowd is looking to bridge that, as is a number of the Israeli government initiatives. We've had a couple of questions around how the situation is impacting female founders, in particular from Wendy Simpson, but I think, and also another question around, I guess, the general challenges for founders and startups in the global market in this time. How are you seeing that?
Well, yesterday I was sitting with one of Israel's leading female angels, who is getting ready to actually launch, specifically now, a women's angel initiative to help. I mean, what's remarkable about women is that you guys are much better than we are, and I'll admit this sounds like old school, at multitasking. Okay, you're born that way. Okay, men have a particular difficulty with multitasking, and that's what it's all about now. We're all multitasking. We have to. Okay, except that how a woman can handle family, kids, her existing business, a new business, and the war effort is remarkable, and you're watching it all the time. So I think that maybe women are affected big time, but they're able to handle it, and we need more women entrepreneurs and more women investors. Okay, it is a shanda, to use a Yiddish word, an embarrassment, a shame, that we have less than 10% women general partners in venture capital funds. We have less than 10% women CEOs, and we need all the help we can get to increase that. And anybody who's interested in talking to us about that, we're going to probably support this new initiative of Women Angels, and we would like very much to hear from you.
Fantastic. And would you like to make any final comments, Ohad, before we hand to Paul?
How can I match what John just said? It would be impossible. I just wanna mention that the fact that it's very important to understand that there are challenges to the Israeli economy and to the Israeli tech ecosystem, but there are so many opportunities even now. New ideas, new initiatives, new innovation coming out still. And as I said in a different session, Israel continues to deliver no matter what. And we do encourage all of you to approach us, because there are opportunities. There is a work plan for 2024, because we don't have another choice. We have to keep the economy going, because this is who we are. It's in our DNA. And hopefully we will meet in a much better circumstances than these. And thank you everyone for joining. And again, thanks Michelle and Paul for facilitating this event.
Thank you so much, Ohad and John. And if I can just now invite Paul Israel, my counterpart, my colleague at our sister brother chamber at the Israel Australia Chamber of Commerce, to wrap up and to thank our speakers.
Thanks, Michelle, and congratulations on organising another insightful and informative webinar. The IACC very much enjoys the partnership with the IACC in Sydney under your leadership and that of Gillian Siegel. The delegations you've been bringing the last couple of years are always of the highest quality, and we look forward to hosting them again in 2024 and beyond. How pertinent that the theme of this year's AICC Women's Leaders Delegation was resilience. The Chamber's had the pleasure of knowing John Medved for well over 25 years now. The connection started with his late father, David, who was the ultimate mensch. And if you don't know that Yiddish word, I encourage you to look it up. John is a pioneer, and via OurCrowd, he has led the disruption of the VC market on a global scale. In 2011, the AICC in Sydney brought a high-caliber trade delegation, which was led by Graham Bradley, who at the time was the chairman of the Business Council of Australia. One of the delegates was Heather Ridout, then CEO of the Australian Industry Group, who invited John to come to Australia and speak with political and business leaders. This trip played a pivotal role in John not only setting up OurCrowd, but also giving the Australian leadership much confidence and motivation to develop its own high-tech ecosystem, the results of which we see today. Nearly every delegation we host, there is either direct OurCrowd involvement or via one of the numerous portfolio companies. A connection, John, we are very proud of. Also want to thank Ohad and the Trade Commission for his partnership with the Chamber. His presentation today gave extra light on how resilient the Israeli economy is. Till October 7, the IACC had hosted close to 20 delegations, and I'm delighted to tell you that we are already getting queries about new delegations for 2024 starting in March. So please be in touch with Michelle and myself about a delegation that you can join. Otherwise, we at the IACC are busy with our technology scouting for large Australian companies in the agricultural space, mining, energy, banking, and more. Look forward to seeing you soon in person so you can witness firsthand not only the magic of Israel, but the culture of resilience. Thank you and shalom.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. Good night. Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
So hard.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.